Good morning, everyone. Welcome. We'll begin in just a few seconds as we let everyone joining connect to their audio. All right. Good morning, everyone. Happy Thursday, and welcome to this morning's San Francisco Interfaith Council's weekly online briefing for faith leaders. Today's topic, the immediate harm, root causes, and prevention-oriented solutions being taken to stem the tide of racial violence suffered by Asian Americans in our city and beyond. This event is hosted by the San Francisco Interfaith Council and supported by the Joint Information Center of the San Francisco COVID Command Center. Some housekeeping for today. Audio, video, and chat will be monitored and recorded for record keeping, training, and quality assurance. By default, all participants will be muted and video turned off to minimize distractions. For chat, to submit a question or comment, select the chat button at the bottom of your screen and send a message to Q&A. They will be shared with the speakers and panelists after this meeting for a response. Thank you. We are in this together. We can only reopen safely as long as we all stay vigilant and wear face coverings, practice physical distancing, and avoid indoor gatherings with members of other households. Go to sf.gov/reopening for more information. A safe and effective COVID-19 vaccine, coupled with continued preventative measures, are our best tools to end the COVID-19 pandemic and safely reopen San Francisco. Go to sf.gov/COVID vaccine for information on eligibility, vaccination sites, including locations and links to book appointments if available. Now at this time, I'd like to hand the floor over to the Executive Director of the San Francisco Interfaith Council, Michael Pappas. Michael, the floor is yours.
Lisa, thank you so very much. And thank you to the wonderful team over at the COVID Command Center's Joint Information Center Virtual Outreach Team. This is our 43rd program. And without your team providing the platform, the staff, and just the wonderful technology for us to be able to put these programs on, so many people would not know what they know. And we are just so grateful to all of you. Thank you. Good morning. I'm Michael Pappas, and on behalf of the San Francisco Interfaith Council, I want to welcome you to this week's online briefing for faith leaders. In response to the recent surge of anti-Asian racism, the respected nonprofit Chinese for Affirmative Action and their partners at Stop Asian American Pacific Islander Hate launched a reporting center to track and respond to incidents of racial bias. From March 2020 through December 2020, over 3,000 self-reported accounts were documented throughout the country and over 700 here in the Bay Area. Recent incidents of violence against Asian elders have sparked outrage and attention from community members, faith leaders, elected officials, policymakers, the media, and other stakeholders. Chinese for Affirmative Action is playing a leading role addressing the immediate harm and root causes of this violence and is advancing prevention-oriented solutions. This week's online briefing for faith leaders, hosted by the San Francisco Interfaith Council and supported by the COVID Command Center's Joint Information Center, welcomes Chinese for Affirmative Action Co-Executive Director Cynthia Choi and 3 respected faith panelists who will address this critical issue in these times of the COVID-19. And now it is my pleasure and privilege, and without further ado, to welcome the Chairman of the Board of the San Francisco Interfaith Council, Kaushik Roy.
Thank you so much, Michael. Good morning, everybody. As Michael mentioned, my name is Kaushik, and on behalf of the Council's Board of Directors, it is my real pleasure and privilege to extend a warm welcome to all of you. Michael noted that we've had over 40 of these conversations over the past 12 months, and some of those have definitely been sobering ones, but I am not sure if any of them will be as sobering as perhaps this morning's conversation will be. The decision for this week's topic was actually made several weeks ago due to the unacceptable and rising incidents of violence towards our Asian American neighbors and Asian neighbors. And of course, you don't need me to say how painfully relevant the topic is this morning because of what happened just about 36 hours ago. And so I want to give a special thank you to Cynthia and all of our special guests for being here this morning and leading us in what I'm sure will be very possibly difficult but enlightening and necessary conversation. I also would be remiss if I didn't thank our mighty staff of two before we continue. Michael Pappas and Cynthia Zamboukas do so much more work than a two-person staff should ever be asked to do. And the entire board and the entire interfaith community is grateful to the two of you. So thank you. And I also want to extend my thanks to the faith community and the interfaith community of San Francisco. What happened the other night, I feel, is one of those impossible to ignore poignant reminders of perhaps just how broken our world might be. And I know for myself in those moments how important it is to be around kindred souls. And I think all of us here are around kindred souls this morning. So thank you all again for joining us. For those of you who may be joining us for the first time, I want to extend a special welcome to you. At the beginning of every Interfaith Council meeting or gathering, we do have an interfaith statement that we like to read just to take a moment to remind ourselves why we're gathered here this morning. And so I'll go ahead and read that now. This is an interfaith community. Whatever our individual belief, it can be freely expressed here with no apologies. If we are invited to offer a prayer in this setting, it should be offered according to the tradition with which we identify. If we are invited to speak on a subject from the perspective of our tradition, we are free to do so without fear of offending those who come from another tradition. We come together as people of faith to learn from each other that we might better understand the multiplicity of faith traditions in our city and in our world. Good morning, everybody.
Thank you, Kaushik, and thank you for your ongoing leadership and commitment to this program in particular. It's a blessing. At this time, I'd like to welcome the Reverend Deborah Lowe Skinner, who is the vicar of Christ Episcopal Church here in San Francisco, as well as the president of the Japanese American Religious Federation and the past chair of the Asian Pacific Islander Commission of the Episcopal Diocese of California, to lead us in a reflective moment.
Thank you, Michael, and thank you all for joining us. I wanted to start with a personal reflection of growing up in San Francisco and then end with a prayer. I grew up in San Francisco in the 1950s on Pacific Avenue in Chinatown. Though I didn't speak Cantonese, I knew I was Chinese because every once in a while my mother would remind us that China was an advanced culture for centuries, while the Saiyan, the non-Chinese, were still living back in the caves. So at any rate, mostly, I didn't give a lot of thought that I was Chinese, or more precisely, third generation Chinese American, an ABC, American born Chinese, because where I lived, and if you lived between Larkin and Kearny, between Broadway and Sacramento Street, you were in Chinatown, we were all Chinese. So it was just who you were, and you didn't think about being different at all. In fact, my elementary school was 100% Chinese. So we didn't worry then about any verbal abuse, or worried about being beaten up or stabbed or shot by anyone within Chinatown or anybody coming from outside Chinatown coming in. We more worried about in the 1950s about nuclear annihilation from the Soviet Union back in the day. When my family could afford to buy a house, we moved in 1963 out to 18th Avenue in the Richmond district. And there I went to Presidio Junior High School and then George Washington High School. And I was surprised to see that instead of 100% Chinese, it was a third white, a third Black, and a third Asians, and not just Chinese, but Japanese American, Filipino American, etc. And it was then, especially with the burgeoning civil rights movement, that I recognized as a Chinese American, I was a minority. And not only that, the rhetoric at the time pointed out that my beloved Chinatown wasn't just a neighborhood, it was a ghetto. That was pretty eye-opening at the time. But regardless of all the foregoing, most of the kids at school and in the Richmond got along. Again, we didn't worry about any verbal abuse, anyone being stabbed, beaten up, or shot. We more worried about we wouldn't be able to get into the college of our choice, or if we were employed, that we could get the job that we want at an equal pay of what others were getting. And then when I moved down to the Silicon Valley to work as an engineer, I noticed that there was, again, a diversity of people and everybody got along. I didn't worry about any racial discrimination as much as I was worried as a woman engineer suffering from sexism. So we fast forward now some 30 years, and now we see a ramping up of violence and targeting persons of color and more troubling people in our Asian American communities. So I wanted to offer this prayer. Most merciful and compassionate God, giver of life, lover of souls, O holy, omnipotent, and omniscient God, hear our prayers and let our cries come unto you. Since your creation of the heavens and earth, you made humankind in your vision, in your image, male and female. You created us in a vast array of colors, ethnicities, and tongues to live together harmoniously and inhabit this fragile earth, our island home. Your beloved Son, Jesus Christ, modeled for us and commanded us to love one another as you love each and every one of us. But some have fallen short of that commandment. In the wake of the current devastating coronavirus pandemic, some troubled and misguided persons have chosen to lash out in fear, hatred, and ignorance at those different than themselves. Most recently, they have harassed, harmed, and even killed our Asian American sisters and brothers, especially the most vulnerable, defenseless, and elderly. Across this country, we hear and see news of attacks on Asian American persons and their property. Most recently, in the last few days alone, in Atlanta and here in San Francisco on Market Street. We pray to you, dear God. You are strength to those who suffer and a comfort to those who grieve. Let the prayers of your children who are troubled rise to you. We claim your promises of wholeness as we pray for those who have lost loved ones due to racial violence and those who are ill or suffering loss and long for your healing touch. Make the fearful courageous, the weak strong, the sick healthy, the broken whole, and make us agents of your love and reconciliation. I end with this prayer from the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King. When our eyes do not see the gravity of racial justice, shake us from our slumber and open our eyes, O Lord. When out of fear we are frozen into inaction, give us a spirit of bravery, O Lord. When we try our best but say the wrong things, give us a spirit of humility. When the chaos of this dies down, give us a lasting spirit of solidarity, O Lord. When it becomes easier to point fingers outward, help us to examine inwards our own hearts. Racism breaks your heart, break our hearts or to what breaks yours, O Lord. An ever-present God, you called us to be in relationship with one another and promised to dwell whenever 2 or 3 are gathered together in your name. In our community, we are many different people. We come from many different places, have many different cultures. Open our hearts that we may be bold in finding the riches of inclusion and the treasures of diversity among us. This we pray in faith. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, Reverend Skinner, for grounding us in this reflective moment. In the sacred text in which I was raised, we hear when one member of the body hurts, the entire body hurts. As Kaushik mentioned, this conversation about violence and anti-racism towards our Asian American sisters and brothers has been a topic that we as the San Francisco Interfaith Council, both our board and the greater community, are saddened by, pained by, wrestling with, wanting to help. And for that reason, we are very, very grateful to welcome Cynthia Choi, the co-executive director of Chinese for Affirmative Action. I would say that, save Dr. Tomas Aragon, Cynthia is the only featured presenter that we have invited back to present twice. She came back on May 21st of last year to address COVID hate speech targeted against Asian people at the very beginning of the pandemic. And now she is back to discuss with us also the issues of violence that have erupted over the course of the COVID-19. Cynthia, there are over 100 people on this line right now who are awaiting your presentation. So without further ado, we welcome you with an open heart and a desire to be good allies and of support. So the floor is yours.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me back. Tomorrow will actually be the 1-year anniversary when we launched Stop API Hate. And to be back here in the wake of the tragedy in Georgia, it's playing out some of our worst fears when we launched this initiative, which is why I think it's important for me to just express our condolences for those surviving family members. The 8 people who were murdered were people with families, with friends, whose lives have been destroyed by this act of violence. And it's important for me to also add to this grounding moment to express that deeply, and for us to say that we stand with the community in Georgia who are now processing and grieving and mourning. And I think this is really important for me to say before I start my presentation. So let me go ahead and get this up. And if I could get a thumbs up that you are seeing what I'm hoping that you're seeing. Let me start from the beginning. Okay, great. So let me just start with why we launched this site. Like many of you at the beginning of the pandemic, we were seeing news accounts of this deadly virus. And even in the early days of the pandemic, the mainstream media was calling it the China virus and Wuhan virus. And we were starting to see accounts of Asian Americans being attacked and verbally harassed, as well as racist social media posts. And of course, this isn't something new. And because there was historic precedence, we knew right away that we needed to start tracking what was happening And so CAA and our partners at the Asian Pacific Policy and Planning Council, which is based in LA, it's a 40-member coalition. And then our partners at SF State Asian American Studies Department launched our site, as I mentioned, in March 19th, 2020. And we initially, the backstory was we had wanted the state attorney general to start tracking this. And they said, you know, basically that that's not what they do. And so we started tracking it. We actually modeled it after the Southern Poverty Law Center that tracks incidents of hate. And we knew that we had to provide it in language. And so in addition to English, we have reports, people are able to report in 11 different languages. Before I go into the data, which I think is important, I wanted to have you see for yourself the kinds of things that Asian Americans reported on our site. So many of you have seen, I think, video and news accounts, but you could see there's been a range of incidents, you know, from elderly parents, you know, walking with their grandchildren and being verbally harassed, to, you know, people going to the hardware store and being physically attacked. One of the first cases that our partner in LA got involved with was a child that had been previously bullied by other students, but COVID was weaponized and they took the sort of verbal bullying to the next level and beat up this 12-year-old child so badly that he had to be taken to the emergency room. And stories about how the school, you know, really did not, you know, take it very seriously. So I think it's, again, important to know that these are real people, firsthand accounts that came into our site. So very, very top level, to date, we have close to 3,800 incidents that of firsthand accounts. Most of the incidents, I will want to stress, are not hate crimes. And what we mean by that is that these acts are not criminal. They cannot, there cannot be arrest. There's no law enforcement component to it. But I want to stress that they are traumatizing acts and have made Asian Americans feel for their safety. And we can go into more about and how that's really translated. We're receiving reports from all 50 states, and we also are receiving reports from District of Columbia. As you can see, we have a majority of our incident reports are coming from California and New York State, and that women are more than 2 times likely to report incidents of verbal and physical harassment. And I think this is really important to note, especially in light of the tragedy in Georgia, and that roughly 6% of our respondents are seniors. So we wanted to go more into depth. You could see here the types of, I think, discrimination that Asian Americans have experienced, and keeping in mind, we've been largely sheltering in place. So, you know, obviously less on public transportation, you're seeing less in the workplace, but that's largely because for many of us, we can work from home. Much of this is happening out in public spaces. And so, you know, these are the types of things that that individuals are encountering. So again, largely 90 to 95% are not criminal. And so I think in terms of responses, we need to be looking at, you know, traditional responses such as focus on hate crimes legislation are not really going to necessarily address this widespread and pervasive issue. So here we talk about, you know, where this is happening in private businesses, so retail operations, on the public streets, in the parks, and even in people's neighborhoods. That's been really disturbing to see that people who were neighbors for many, many years are shunning Asians, are verbally harassing Asians. And it's been a very hostile climate as well. This provides some idea of the fact that all Asian Americans are being subjected to discrimination, anti-Asian racism. But as you can see, the primary target has been Chinese, or those who perceive to be Chinese, because of how COVID has been racialized and how China has been blamed. And of course, we can't ignore that US-China relations has a big factor in this as well. So I think it's important to talk about the impacts of this racism. So, you know, what we're seeing is that this has led to serious levels of mental health and distress, skyrocketing levels of depression and anxiety from leaving their homes. And, you know, a more recent statistic that we've seen is 3 out of 10 Asian Americans have encountered some form of racist experience, from verbal harassment and other types of despicable acts. While at the same time, we're seeing that Asian Americans are also frontline workers, essential workers, have high rate of unemployment, and so many businesses, small businesses, have been affected by this time. But we also want to note that Asian American businesses have also been affected by the racism. CAA is located in the heart of Chinatown, and we saw immediately, even before the shelter in place took effect, that many people were avoiding Asian businesses, especially restaurants, because of racist notions of COVID and how it was being racialized. And it's really important, especially for us at CAA, to talk about the fact that we have had many years of anti-immigrant policies. We have been subjected to racial profiling. Many of our communities, parts of our community, have been subjected to institutional forms of racism. This last administration, or former administration, had tried to make it very, very difficult for immigrants who are here to access vital resources by expanding the public charge rule. And of course, our immigration system, the deportation of Southeast Asians, and family separation has had a devastating impact on our community as well. So why has this happened? And I think it's important to bring in history. The history of anti-Asian racism and discrimination defines our experience as Asian Americans, as immigrants, and that it's important to note that at different times of crises, public health, economic, certainly with US foreign policy, immigrants have been scapegoated and are vulnerable to being targeted. And I think the anti-Asian, anti-China rhetoric really is responsible for this latest wave of anti-Asian racism. Again, not new, but certainly unprecedented levels of discrimination that Asians are experiencing. So what do we do? So we have, not only because of our work through Stop API Hate, but we have been tracking and analyzing the anti-Asian racism, because it's important for us to have data, to be informed, and so that we could propose responsible solutions. So really a big part, you know, almost 50% of my time has been really educating the public and the media about this issue. I think that it's been important that we establish this tracker because when it comes to issues of importance in our community, it tends to be invisibilized, it tends to be minimized, and we wanted to have the data. And again, we have maintained that this is an underreporting of what's actually happening, in our community for a variety of reasons. And so we are grateful that individuals came onto our site and that trusted us with very, very horrific and traumatizing stories. Um, we are also very committed to identifying community resources at this time. So individuals contact us about incidents. We also are, working with government agencies who are reaching out to us about the data and what's happening in their local jurisdiction to develop strategies. And, I think I want to just lift up, the fact that Reverend Norman Fong and so many in the local Bay Area have been trying to address this issue for decades. And I think that's been one of our assets to be able to say that we need to have more partnerships with government. We need to have a whole of society response to anti-Asian racism. And really, we're having a conversation right now about non-carceral approaches. We cannot address racism in our country through incarceration. We cannot address racism through hate crimes legislation. We cannot address this matter through policing. We have to focus on ways in which we can address the underlying causes of racism and what the drivers are around violence, hate, and racial bias. And this is really important to recognize that we have had this amazing ability to work with elected officials and government leaders at the local, state, and national level. One of our partners today is testifying before the House Judiciary Committee about our work, along with other leaders, experts on this subject. And it's really important at this time for us to come together, both as a community, government, and this is why I'm so excited to be here with faith leaders who I have personally leaned on in these dark times to really ask the question, what can we do as a society to deal with the scourge of racism and the ways in which I think it's divided us, in ways in which we have that it's been allowed to fester, and the ways in which it's denied us of our basic humanity, denied us of our basic human rights. And I think that this is a moment so often referred to as a period of racial reckoning. And the more that we can see each other, the more that we can see how white supremacy and the structure of racism thrives because it effectively has divided us and pitted us against each other. And so I'm incredibly inspired by the ways in which all sectors of society are examining not only the history of racism, but also really trying to listen and learn and are asking themselves what can be done during this time. And so I'd like to just end here by stating that locally, CAA and our partners at CPA and other, and the Community Youth Center and New Breath Foundation, we are part of a coalition that has come together in times of crisis when somebody has been killed, attacked, and we had been working on these issues for quite some time, working on issues of racial equity, of economic justice, of making sure that our government serves everyone, regardless of immigration status and the ability to speak English, to put forward an initiative that really is focused on how we can support survivors and their families who have been affected by violence, and to make sure that they receive the full range of support that's needed, and to invest in intervention and prevention strategies that, again, really get at the underlying causes of violence and of crime, and the racial tensions that we have here in the Bay Area and throughout the country. One of the things that we know, and this isn't just my opinion, is that when we have working class communities struggling to make ends meet, when we don't allow people to have what they need to be able to take care of themselves, to live dignified lives, to have hope, that's where we see violence, and that's where we see racial tensions manifest. And so if we can work towards these larger equity issues, work towards better schools, job opportunities, initiatives that really focus on anti-racist education, to be able to see each other, to be in community with each other. Until we can do those things, it will be very difficult for us to be able to heal and to work towards those efforts that are really going to truly make our communities safe. And so, again, I'm incredibly inspired by the fact that we're recognizing that structural racism has been embedded in the founding of this country. And we're recognizing that this is the roots of our challenges today. Because without recognizing that, it will be very difficult for us to be able to move forward. And in the wake of what happened in Georgia, I'm saddened by the fact that it takes these types of tragedies for us to really reflect on what we need to be doing moving forward. But I would say that it's also in these times of crisis that allows us to reimagine, to ask ourselves, that we can't keep doing what we have traditionally been relying on to address public safety issues, to address racial and economic disparities that COVID has really exposed in such dramatic ways. So I, again, am so pleased to be in community with you. And in some ways, it's so appropriate that I'm here with you, given what a sad time this is, to be in community with many of you who lead your communities with tremendous moral authority, with tremendous empathy. And I think we need more of that now than ever.
Cynthia, thank you for this very comprehensive and at the same time moving and timely presentation. As you know, most civil rights and human rights movements have been led by communities of faith throughout history. And I'm reminded today of William Shakespeare's point that was made in the play, The Tempest: what is past is prologue. Today, what we'd like to do is to look at other communities also who have been victimized by violence and racial tension, and to see how they have done it in the past, and then to have them ask a question of you as well. And let us begin with Reverend Dr. James McCray, the Executive Director of the Tabernacle Community Development Corporation. Dr. McCray. Dr. McCray.
Reverend Pappas.
Reverend Dr. McCray.
Interfaith Council. I begin by saluting you for what you do to foster the witness of the faith community in San Francisco. Reverend Pappas and members of the Interfaith Council, thank you. Reverend Norman Fong, my longtime friend, thank you for the invitation to share on your team this morning. And then to all of San Francisco, I want to say, hold on and stand. We must be determined, and we will get beyond the sunset of this pandemic. And we will address the ills that confront us as a city. We will work together to seek the welfare of the city. We will see beyond the fog of racism and hate to the relationships that form our shared humanity. Thank you for this opportunity to share a word and to ask a question. And I pause right now to ask my elder, Reverend Fong, if I continue or if he's going to say something before I do.
No, it's your turn, but I also want to say thank you for serving on the Chinatown CDC board forever.
Forever. It is out of that context, thank you, sir, that I want to speak for a moment and ask my question in the speaking of the 5 minutes. I'm speaking to the purpose of this morning's gathering to address the immediate harm, root causes, prevention-oriented solutions being taken to stem the tide of racial violence suffered by Asian Americans in our city and beyond. I want to focus for a few moments on the issue of prevention-oriented solutions that are responsive to the question I want to raise: how do we aim at herd immunity against hate generated inhumanity? Sister Choi, in her presentation, there was the big slide that said, hate is a virus. How do we create, disperse, dispense, and deploy a neutralizing antibody against hatred in our various districts and communities here in the city and county of San Francisco?
Beautiful.
An anti-white supremacist formulation of history and our connections and relationships in the past and in the present must be shaped. And the publication of these truths must be essential to the educational system that attends our work of creating this herd immunity. Dr. Kane Hope Felder, in Troubling Biblical Waters, writes about biblical meaning and the Black religious experience. And I would suggest the entire religious experience. He says it is founded and rooted in African Asian or Afro-Asiatic encounters, interactions, cross-cultural fertilizations. Many Africans at the beginning of Christian history lived in and traveled in both Africa and Asia, and Asians did the same. Gordon Chin, in his book, Building Community Chinatown Style, tells of African and Asian togetherness as the seeds of the local movement for change and the justice movement manifested at San Francisco State, at Berkeley, during that critical part of the movement's development and the Black Panthers coming on in here in the Bay Area. African Asian. For me, James McCrae Jr., a native San Franciscan, reared in the Bayview district between Inner Street to Oakdale and then to Gottingen, Asian and African American relationships were the norm. We were neighborly and cordial. We must bathe our minds and hearts in this reality, and especially those of our young folks, their minds, their hearts, to help bring into being neutralizing antibodies.
Wow.
The state of fear, presently driven by 45 and spread by the media, is contributing to this national sense of frustration. The week before last, Black Lives Matter, as the late Mr. Floyd's words rang in our ears, "I can't breathe." At the same time, children are on our borders, separated from their moms, crying out, "Biden, let us in." While our Muslim imams and neighboring faith communities are struggling to protect their temples and properties and adherents from attacks from outside the community. Asian Americans are demanding an end to racist acts of hatred, resulting in injustice, pain, and death, as the words of the late Pat Ho and others echo in our spirits. We must learn to respect each other and live in community. In an environment characterized by mental health crises, trauma, stress, anxiety, depression, uncertainty, deepened by individual self-regulatory failures, unprovoked flashes of violent attacks, a peculiar breakthrough and a lack of structure, the collapse of identified personal and community spaces and markers. Neutralized antibodies must be created and seeded in these neighborhoods and districts and the institutions of our city. The awakened, you and I, must re-energize. One, identify and acknowledge places of our shared humanity in this city. Two, create antibody cells to address shared issues of community enhancement, housing, employment, education, health, recreation. And three, call out, celebrate, contribute to the growth and proliferation of antibody institutional models, which brings me to my conclusion. The motto I lift up is Chinatown CDC and Tabernacle Community Development Corporation. Under government aegis, a business partnership was created to develop affordable housing for the homeless and for seniors. Mary Helen Rogers, 100 units plus commercial space at 770 Golden Gate, a model of bringing together in this time, in these crises, Asian and African American and city agencies to form and to seed neutralizing antibodies in the Pings, in Alice Griffith, and in other areas throughout this city. I return to my question, Sister Choi. How do we develop and seed anti-hate, neutralizing antibodies to work in this city? Thank you for your listening.
Beautiful. It's back to you,
I'm very
Cindy.
moved by this talk, because I think that one of the things that I've learned through the course of the work, and I've actually, I want to go back to the fact that much of my experience was shaped by the 1992 uprising in LA. And there it was really framed as conflicts between the Black and the Korean community. And there was a real denial of what was happening in LA. Police brutality, The fact that, you know, the manufacturing base where people had good jobs, union paying jobs, jobs that allowed people to live a decent life, that was basically gutted. And then you had parts of LA that, you know, really lacked any infrastructure to support people. And of course, you know, the crack cocaine epidemic there and how that ravaged communities. And so rather than respond in ways that I think could, you know, address those issues with jobs and making sure that we could support people who had substance abuse issues and responding to people who with behavioral health issues with more compassionate, effective responses, we ended up policing. We ended up incarcerating away these issues. And so I see a lot of that coming to fore and continuing here, I think in San Francisco and the Bay Area. One of the things that I wanted to put forth is that over 10 years ago, there were incidents of violence and racial tensions. Reverend Fong knows as well, between the Black and the Asian, primarily Chinese community. And at that time, you know, and throughout our history at CAA, we have recognized that in order to address anti-Asian racism, we have to be in lockstep with addressing anti-Black racism. That without addressing that issue, we can never fundamentally address the hatred towards our community. And so that is why we've rejected carceral approaches. This is why we work so hard to do education within our community, political education to talk about the history of why we have a civil rights movement, why there was an opening up of our immigration system because of the civil rights movement led by the Black community. But we have to be honest with the fact that we have demographic shifts in our community. We have more recent immigrants who don't understand that history. And, you know, we have to talk about social media. We have to talk about the fact that misinformation and disinformation spreads like wildfire. And this doesn't just happen in English media. This is also happening in the Chinese and other language social media platforms. And it is, I think it's having such a severe impact that we've had to figure out how do we counter that? And I think this is a real challenge before us that's different, I think, from like 10 years ago. And so it's incredibly important that we find ways to support our communities in this time of fear, and then to really think about more ways that we can support cross-community dialogue. But I'm convinced, as I have from my experience with the LA uprising, that obviously dialogue is not enough. We need to find ways where people can concretely work towards efforts that'll fundamentally improve their lives. Better schools, more green spaces, jobs, opportunities for young people. And actually, I do want to draw from the fact that young people, more than anyone, understands what this moment means. And they're speaking out in ways that I think are just so incredibly powerful. And I think they're not the future. They are leading. They are talking about these issues. And they are talking about how they want to create change. So I think this is an incredibly dark time, but in crises, there's also opportunity to fundamentally get back to what's going to really create transformative change.
Thank you, Dr. McCray, Reverend Dr. McCray, for that thoughtful question, and of course for your moving presentation, as well as for the very thoughtful and comprehensive answer, Cynthia. The Muslim community is no stranger to victimization of this kind. racism, violence, and profiling. We are very blessed to have with us today a member of our board. We claim her. I claim her as a dear friend, but also as a commissioner from the San Francisco Human Rights Commission, our dear Hala Hijazi. Hala, would you give us the Muslim perspective on this issue and then pose a question to Cynthia?
Thank you so much, Brother Michael and Dr. James Cray, and especially my brother Norman Fong and Koshik and Cynthia for your leadership, and especially to our special guest, Cynthia. Thank you. I'm going to also talk about the Muslim community, but it's just, I think we need to talk about it in the larger context. So in the name of God, the most gracious, the most merciful, assalamu alaikum. Today, we come together in faith, to stand in grief, in solidarity, and in prayer with our API brothers and sisters against anti-Asian hate and violence. We stand with you as you have stood with us, so many of us, including the Muslim and Arab communities. The target and murder of 8 people, including 6 Asian women in Atlanta, and yesterday's, yesterday's attack on at least 2 elderly people on our streets in San Francisco are horrific. The cowardice and cruelty is unconscionable. During these times, we are reminded by the blessed words of Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. O mankind, I have created you from male and female and made you into tribes and nations that you may know each other, not that you may despise each other. The believers and their mutual kindness, compassion, and sympathy are just like one body. When one of the limbs suffers, the whole body responds to it with wakefulness and fever. And by our blessed brother, Martin Luther King, who said, never, never be afraid to do what's right, especially if the well-being of a person or an animal is at stake. Society's punishments are small compared to the wounds we inflict on our soul when we look the other way. Brothers and sisters, our community is one body. We are very much awake. We are with fever, and we can no longer look the other way. White supremacy and a rising tide of racist, xenophobic rhetoric, hate and violence, and murders are haunting and traumatizing our brothers and sisters, especially our youth and elderly of the Asian American community. These acts are not only impacting their physical, mental, and emotional health, but also violating their dignity and human rights and civil rights, and also our national security. As people of faith and San Franciscans, we know that diversity is our strength and unity is our power. Our leadership begins with us at home, in our places of worship, online and on our streets. We must demonstrate by example that domestic terrorism, discrimination, and racism will not be tolerated, not in San Francisco. Our diverse communities must work together to create opportunities to have difficult conversations, build trust, and learn each other's histories and struggles. We must demand anti-racism and bias and cultural sensitivity trainings for educators, law enforcement, public officials, and servants and healthcare providers. We need to ensure that K-12 has ethnic studies programming and increase initiatives like Know Your Neighbor and Know Your Classmates. As faith in action communities, we need to hold our public officials accountable for their actions and actions. Are they demanding training? Are they reporting and prosecution of hate crimes and assaults? At the same time, we have to hold ourselves and each other accountable. We know that insensitive and hateful narrative rhetoric, violence, rhetorical violence, always precedes physical violence. What do we do when we hear jokes and name calling at dinner tables, barbecues, on our basketball courts? What do we do when we see our children bullied on our muni, on our playgrounds, and our elderly being harassed or attacked on our streets? We are going to call them out. Like Reverend Norman Fong, we're going to call them out. We're going to the streets and we're going to call them out. We're going to step in. It's no longer see something, say something. It's see something, do something. As interfaith leaders, we need to open up our doors and welcome other faiths and nationalities. We need to diversify our speakers. We need to invite them to our homes. We need to fight for and embrace each other's dignity. Last night, I couldn't sleep because I saw the video of the 75-year-old woman that was attacked and punched on San Francisco streets. Because for two main reasons. She reminded me of my 76-year-old mother, who last weekend, when I saw in Sunnyvale in a safe neighborhood, and she just walked me outside to the garage, and she wanted to go take a walk outside the neighborhood. I told her not to do that because of what's happening. I told her, don't go alone. She wears hijab. She's a short, vulnerable 76-year-old lady, but it's because of what's happening. I told her in a safe neighborhood not to go by herself. I'm reminded as a Muslim who took Mayor Brown and the police chief Lau to the 20 Jones Street Mosque right after 9/11, that Friday. When I left the mosque, I was chased by two women and almost attacked. I am reminded of what can happen to each one of us, regardless of our class, socioeconomic status, where we're from. So we need to do better. We really need to make sure that we talk about the real racism that's happening in each of our communities, the racism, the prejudice, the lack of education in our churches, in our mosques, in our synagogues. We can no longer lie and pretend that we don't have those issues in our places of worship, in our community-based organizations. We really need to step up. So to Cynthia, what can we do? What more can we do? Right now, my concern is Chinatown or the Tenderloin, where the most vulnerable are. I'm so grateful for so many people around the country that when New Zealand happened, they stepped up and they secured our place. They came to the mosques in Santa Clara and stood by us, made sure that we prayed in peace, that we prayed without fear for our lives. What can we do to protect our Asian brothers and sisters and our mothers? Because those women, that's my mother yesterday. They got attacked. So what do we need to do?
Thank you so much for your words. And, you know, I think that it's incredibly important to name the fact that so many communities have been affected by structural racism. And every time that I talk about the history of targeting and criminalizing community members, I talk about the period leading up to post 9/11 and to today, how the Muslim community, the Amemsa community, has been subjected to this form of racism. And I think this is why with the Muslim ban that the Trump administration had posed, the Asian community came together to stand with the Muslim community because, of course, Asians and Chinese in particular know very well what that has meant to be named and banned and to be painted as an existential threat to our democracy. And as you've been sharing, it is, you know, this is the concern. It starts with rhetoric that legitimizes policies, that legitimizes and emboldens individuals to act on this hate. And so I think it is incredibly important to first understand that history and that connection, because I think racism and structural racism really wants us to not know about each other's history, to somehow think that this is isolated, that this isn't systemic. And the fact of the matter is, the more that we understand this historically, it does inform, I think, what we need to do moving forward. And so it's been incredibly powerful to have allies stand with us at this time. And I think it really does demonstrate to the Asian American community that we also need to do that in times when other communities have been targeted. What have we done around the fact that children are being separated from their families? What have we done in terms of standing up with the Black community? What are we doing with the fact that we are seeing so many communities ravaged by this pandemic? And what we are seeing is tremendous collective action. Many people don't know about the solidarity that's been expressed towards the Amemsa community, towards the Black community. Our organization has been a part of coalition building because we know that without that work, without that deep, deep work beyond the statements, these relationships are essential in terms of building understanding. Our work around immigrant rights engages with the Amemsa community and Black immigrants. So I think it's really important to find ways in which we can, again, work towards addressing the root causes. So whether that's building coalitions to change laws, to mobilize our communities, to expand civic rights and civic engagement, this is the work that's really necessary. And I think it's also important to note that we can't sugarcoat the fact that it's a struggle. I mean, there's a reason why we called it the civil rights struggle, because at different points, we haven't been on the same page. But that's what builds understanding. Some of my closest relationships and the people who I turn to have been the people and organizations that I've struggled with. And that's meant that we have to speak our truths. We have to speak about the fact that we need to do better in terms of understanding these issues in very nuanced and complex ways. And that's meant even for our organization to commit to addressing structural racism. We're actually preparing to do two things with our staff. One is we are going to be going through a series of discussions, even for us as a civil rights organization dedicated to advancing racial equity, how we can do better to address anti-Black racism, because we see that inextricably being tied. And through our coalition work with the Amemsa community and Black immigrants, how can we talk about advancing a more comprehensive, compassionate immigration reform? Again, this is how it's through the work and it's through the struggle, which makes us stronger. And I think that that's incredibly necessary because what we have is by intention. Our prison system, our criminal justice system, our immigration system, many people call it broken. I say it's doing exactly what it was intended to do. And so the more that we can get around what is really at the heart of harming us, the more that we can come together as a community.
Thank you. Thank you both. You know, in community organizing, we hear that silence equals death. We are a name you've heard raised throughout this conversation is that of Reverend Norman Fong. When I think of dear Norman, I think of Socrates, the gadfly of Athens, who really held society, who held government accountable. And Norman has been an incredible ambassador and voice for the Chinese community and the Asian community in San Francisco. We are blessed to call him a board member. He is an associate pastor at Presbyterian Church of Chinatown, former executive director of the Chinatown Community Development Corporation, and now is serving as government relations, community relations director. Norman, we have you to thank for not only inspiring this program, but for assisting in assembling a lot of the participants. It is without further ado, it is with deep respect and love that I give you the floor, and I thank you from the bottom of my heart.
Thank you, Michael, for empowering me through the SFIC to be able to get the stuff. I was feeling so frustrated and painful with all the violence And I even recalled, oh, sorry, this is not my speech now, but I recalled the feelings I had when I got beat up by Italians as a kid, growing up at a time of segregation in the 50s. Reverend McCrae raised the positivity of San Francisco State in the 60s and the ethnic, ethnic studies movement, Third World Strike. And wow, all of a sudden we broke out of our shells and started working together. My church, Reverend Hammond, I know you're there. The Presbyterian Church in Chinatown, which is my home, is the first Asian church in America, North America. And talk about struggle. The Chinese in Chinatown have struggled since day one. So our church was formed in 1853, and it was Dr. Spear who came from China. And he actually was a doctor because all the Chinese couldn't go to hospitals. Remember that? So our church started a medical clinic. We couldn't find housing. I love my church because they fought for the first HUD 236 project in Chinatown, Million Units Club. I love our church. When I got beat up, they're the ones that helped me. When I got evicted, my home family got evicted. They started the movement for affordable housing right, across the street from us. So what Reverend McCrae shared as antibodies, I love that metaphor. Thank you, because we have struggled together through the years in that way. Hala, she's like tears and heart and soul. We need that passion too of solidarity. Just to hear and see you pray for our community, that counts enough. So I could talk too much, except I just want to say this. Right now, thank you, SFIC. Thank you, all of you who are listening out there. Your support means a lot, especially in these times. Other groups have gone through all kind of chaos and issues, and we can learn from each other. The last thing I want to say is Reverend Jesse Jackson supported us when Vincent Chin was killed in the 80s. Look it up. I don't want to go through all that, but the Japanese auto workers, were considered a threat. And so all the white, Detroit auto workers beat up anyone that looked Asian. And so we've been through this so many times. And the solidarity is what counts. So solidarity with Hala and the Muslim community, with Dr. McCrae, who was also involved with Asian Black issues in the past, the Western edition. Cynthia, thank you so much for being here. My question I want to end up with is, what do you think the faith-based community, even in Chinatown or among the Chinese immigrant churches, there's plenty of them. What can we do to build solidarity in these times? Because right now, there's a polarity between perspectives on what we need. We want more cops, we want more cops, right? And you mentioned that that's not the big strategy. What do you think we can do, Cynthia, and also Michael?
Well, I want to just thank Reverend Norman Fong, who we have been working with for decades on this issue. And I'll just lift up how the faith community has been helpful during this time. And that's been about speaking out about this time. We have leaned on the faith community to lead where you can, using your platform to lift up issues around, questions around, as a society, as a community, what can we do to stamp out, to combat hate in all its forms? And I'll just put a plug in that this Saturday, we are organizing a vigil at noon at Portsmouth Square, really to hold space during a time where our community is in tremendous pain and suffering. And we have leaned on the faith community during this time, to offer healing and compassion and empathy for the community. And I think this is something that I think will be very vital in the days to come. And I think that for those who lead congregations and have the platform, it's incredibly important to listen, because I would say that I've been hearing from across the country tremendous pain and fear. And we all know that when we don't address these issues, it will cause and create further isolation and division amongst our communities. And we actually need to come together more than ever.
Yes.
Thank you so much, Cynthia. And you asked me the question as well. I would like to see a number of our Asian clergy ascend to the pulpits of other faith communities and share the stories and engage other congregations. And here's a way that I think that the San Francisco Interfaith Council can be an ally. I did want to take the prerogative of the moderator to ask one last clarifying question of Cynthia. Data speaks, data is powerful, and it moves policy change. In your tracking, are witnesses able to also make reports?
Yes, very much. So if you witness an incident, you can go to our reporting center at Stop AAPI Hate. In fact, we get quite a number of those incident reports.
Because I think that this is a way that we can get that out in the community as well. I was listening to Hala very carefully, and what can we do? We can do this as well. It's a concrete thing that we can do. We've run over the hour, but we could take a lot more time because this issue demands it and it deserves it. I just want to say a very special thank you to all of our participants today, as well as to Cynthia Zambucas, who is who is our administrative program associate, as well as to Alyssa Karawali, who produced this program, Sharon Walton, who is the lead, and of course to Trey Russell Allen, who is the head of the coordinator of the virtual outreach team. This has been a very illuminating conversation. We invite you all to join us next week when we will be speaking about chaplaincy in crisis times. And it should be a very illuminating conversation. That concludes our program today. Again, I want to say a special thank you to Norman Fong for his leadership as well in bringing us all together. Bless you, Norman, and God bless you all. This concludes our program.
Keep hope alive, everybody. Are we still on?
Yes, you are. And thank you.